Hey, it's Chris Fleming. Welcome back to December 2016 Spirit Talk. Our guest this month is the author of multiple books including Banshees, Werewolves, Vampires, and Other Creatures of the Night, Among the Mermaids, and the Book of Bizarre and Beyond Bizarre. Her forthcoming book, Fairies, Pookas, and Changelings, a complete guide to the wicked and wild enchanted realm, will be available in April of 2017. She can often be found lurking about the deep, dark woods and lakes of Minnesota on the hunt for beastly things, magical herbs, and the elusive little men of legends. Tonight, she's going to be sharing with us weird Christmas stories and Christmas traditions from around the world. Please welcome to the show, Varla Ventura. Welcome, Varla.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Happy holidays.
You too. It's a pleasure to have you on the show this month because we've got the holidays here and we're going to be talking about some weird Christmas stories.
Yeah. It's not all happy elves and shiny things.
Well, you deal with a lot of these different creatures and monsters and entities. What I see listed here, you're talking about Scandinavian Christmas trolls. Is that like a gang? What is this?
Beware the Scandinavian Christmas troll.
Ching, ching.
Yeah. It's very interesting because many cultures throughout time associate this time of year as a very magical time of year. And, we even hear it today, the magic of Christmas. And there's many interpretations to what that means. But there was a time when it was actually believed, and especially in the Nordic countries, that Christmas Eve was actually the eve for witches and trolls and the like. And that were you to be out too late on a Christmas Eve wandering about, you might encounter witches riding on the backs of trolls doing a dance on a fairy mound. So there are many kind of creepy and somewhat unknown creatures that lurk about this time of year. A lot of cultures have associations with Yule, the solstice, and that being a very magical time in trying to bring in, burn fires and bring in some kind of light. And we have, the tradition of lights on a Christmas tree and candles in the windows. But many people for thousands of years equate this time of year very similarly to that of sort of like Halloween times, where the veil between the two worlds is very thin. And so as a result, it's a night for ghosts and a night for goblins and a night for witchery, just as much as it is a night for revelry and joy.
Wow. Did anybody ever do drawings or images of these Scandinavian Christmas trolls, like what they look like?
They're described kind of, a lot of these sort of creatures overlap. Many of them have red caps. That is a very, very common thing. And you can kind of see the evolution of our modern day Santa Claus in some of these descriptions. And you even have an overlap with, say, the Scandinavian Christmas troll and the Nissen or the Tomten or Tontu in Finland. And these are very little creatures, kind of like a Smurf in a way, very little small elf creatures that are usually no more than 3 feet high. And they often they have a beard. They look quite a bit like a very miniature Santa Claus. And if you were to see some of the old fairy tales and the old pictures of them, which were they were kind of repopularized in the 1800s during the Victorian era, a lot of postcards and Christmas cards, but you can still see them today. They look like, we might look at them and think, oh, it's like a little mini Santa Claus. And so this little creature is sort of the equivalent of a Christmas, sort of a Christmas brownie or a Christmas elf that would live in your house and would require a small payment, usually the tomten specifically, or the nisi, like porridge, fresh porridge. And you have to offer it in a certain way. You can't just leave leftovers. And this of course, reminds me very much of our offerings to Santa Claus, that you give him a nice little plate of cookies and milk. And you see this over and over again, especially in a lot of the Irish fairies, where, throughout Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and the other British areas where they would have sort of brownies or hobgoblins, or sometimes they go by many different names, and they would live in the barn or they would live in the house, and they help you with the chores, but you have to kind of pull your own weight, and you must leave them an offering, and it has to be good stuff. You can't just leave a thimble full of, leftover milk. You have to give them a saucer of fresh milk. You can be a thimbleful, but it has to be the finest wine. And as soon as you sort of wrong them, depending on their moods, they could, make things worse. Sometimes they just leave, and then your work is harder. So you have that with the Scandinavian trolls and with some of the other little bogies and things that are out there on Christmas Eve.
I'm sitting here listening to this, and people know, listeners that have been listening to Spirit Talk for a long time, I've talked about little creatures that I've seen from my childhood, and then back in 2009 they appeared again. We call them little imps, little demonic entities that are about 3 feet tall. And I wonder if some of these experiences are them portraying themselves maybe slightly visually, or wearing certain things to pretend they're something else, to disguise, or are we dealing with various other entities or species that are similar in height, no different like we have different types of human beings and different types of organisms and mammals on this planet, that there's many variations. Could there possibly be many variations of these dimensional entities? Have you run into anything like that? Any suggestions of that?
Well, are you frightened when you see them? Do you feel that they're evil, or do they just seem like they're mischievous? Or, what's the context in which you've seen them, especially more recently?
Sure. Well, definitely as a child, I was completely terrified, and they would come after me, and there would be the overwhelming sense of fear, oppression, demonic, as well as like the devil himself is what I felt, as well as people in the house that never came back after they'd seen them. In 2009, it was the same thing. There was strings and strings of bad luck. There was the car crash, broke my nose, torn my eye, financial, medical, everything just went on and on and on after they started appearing. We're talking 7 days after they appeared. Ironically, I have seen them. My ex-girlfriend saw them. A couple of people in my house saw them, and sometimes they take the shape of these black masses. And I don't mean to go off into this tangent, but you said recently, about a month ago, it was on a Sunday. I wasn't feeling well, laying in bed, and then all of a sudden, I saw this thing stand up over by the couch. At first, I thought it was my cat. Stood upright, and then the moonlight coming through the window, you saw its silhouette, and I go, oh my God, I'm looking at this thing, and it's standing completely upright, and very narrow, pointed ears, and the shoulders and the arms that just hung very longer arms. And then there was something that ran across my bed, and I saw it. I got up, I couldn't sleep, and I kept hearing these voices, because the thing is, though, they have these voices very similar to like the Poltergeist, the old lady from the Poltergeist original movie, but more like a child in a raspy, distorted type voice. And so I went into my little den, and I sat there just thinking, like, what the hell? I feel like I'm being attacked. All of a sudden, I saw one come into the visual spectrum, slight apparition of one walking, looking at me, kind of walking like the old famous Bigfoot footage, where he's walking and he turns and looks. But you got this 3-foot creature kind of doing that the opposite way, turns and looks at me as it's doing this gait, and then slowly vanishes and disappears. And I'm looking and going, Jesus, I just saw you. And it was a bad time for me of something I was going through at that particular day. Really bad news that I got and I was dealing with. So it was like they're all attacking at once. And then, and I knew this. I said, I'm just going to ignore you guys. I realize you're coming around like vultures. And then that was it. So the question I've had is, going back to the story dealing with Christmas, is we talk about, there's elves, there's fairies, and you got a book coming out that's going to touch on some of these things. I am not the type of person that believes they're all this, because I've seen so many different things, and we have to realize we discover 13,000 or so new species every year. Let's go into the dimensions and realize there's multiple dimensions. there can be tons of different variations of different creatures and entities. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're sort of touching on the kind of understanding of what the fairy realm is at its core, in its original place, especially in Ireland, where fairies are believed to be of another dimension and formed of the elementals, and that there is no our world versus this world, or there's this place or that place, and you have to, that they're coexisting places, and that there are entryways and certain people who, as the Irish would always call it, the second sight, or the gift of being able to see these beings. I have spoken with many, many people who have had paranormal encounters. Very, very few who have actually seen fairy-like and sort of goblin-like creatures, which sounds to me like what you're describing. And I would certainly entertain the idea that they aren't necessarily, perhaps they're messengers of some kind, but it does seem that when you talked about seeing them as a child, it really brought to mind the idea of changelings. And if you read some of the very early accounts, especially the stuff that, like, William Butler Yeats traveled all around during the Victorian era, he traveled around Ireland, where he was from, and he took, what he called at the time, it was republished under another name later, but at the time he called it Tales from the Irish Peasantry. And so basically what that meant is he's walking around and he's getting the stories from all of the old timers, who, still to this day, you can walk around a place like Ireland and there's I go to church, so I don't believe in this. There's a certain understanding that these sort of beings coexist and always have, and that there's a rich sort of folklore. But my point is that they are not these lovely, hilarious little creatures that just, sew little clothes and flit about. They are very often scary, and they very often do exist to kind of shake people out of different situations and warn them of things. And it's not always nice. And they're often trying to trick or kidnap. And like the idea of a changeling, for example, which is quite a scary idea, is that someone, the fairies, which is just a general term for a huge number of creatures in many different varieties. So they would come and they would take a baby and would leave they would switch, and they would leave this baby-like creature in its place. And the fairies would take the mortal back to, fairyland, and the changeling would remain in its place. And there are some terrifying accounts of parents discovering this changeling, the lengths that they must go to get rid of the changeling and get their child back. And we're talking like red hot pokers and boiling oil and things like that. So it's no joke, and it's no, magic pixie dust kind of world. And so I think there's a very, very dark, but I don't know that I would call it evil, but certainly a very dark element to this world that we gloss over. And, that there's something to that. I mean, the only thing I would add, because I think I would like to talk to you at length about your experiences, the only thing I would add, and forgive me if you've thought all of this over in your mind a million times, if you've been followed since a child, I'm sure you've thought of everything.
Yeah, I know a lot about them, yeah.
I wonder if you left them a glass of wine, what would happen? I mean, it can't hurt.
Yeah. It was basically doing the Ouija board as a kid. We let them in the house, gave them permission. And then the other time how they got back into my house was I had a girlfriend move in and basically gave permission because they were attached to her. And once they were attached to her, they got into the house. Once they were in, I still see them sometimes. And I've talked to other individuals that have seen and experienced these things as well. There's the guy, Bill Vale, who was on the TV show Paranormal Witness with the episode called The Visitors. Anybody listening, if they want to get an idea what these things are like, watched Paranormal Witness, one of the earlier seasons called The Visitors. Bill Vale and I, after I saw that episode, I got in touch with him and we had just 3-4 hour conversations about dealing with these things, and that it was nice to know someone else that understands. But the biggest thing, too, is what I've come to realize is your frame of mind, and the more you let them bother you, the impression you get, the stronger they get, and the more frequent they get. So if you change your mind and everything and try not to focus on them, you get into positive things, they tend to leave you alone because they want to get you into a negative vibration. They want to cause problems. And we can go into a whole other topic about that. I don't want to do that. So the thing is you talk about these Christmas stories. We talk about, of course, elves with the tradition of Santa Claus and everything. And there's been the traditions of Scandinavian, the Christmas trolls. What other type of interesting creatures have developed over centuries related to Christmas?
Well, I mean, you have many other creatures. For example, in Bavaria, there's a traditional creature, and I'll probably mispronounce many words in the next few minutes here, but I'm going to do my best. You have the Berchti, which is sort of a bogey that cuts open. I hope there are no children listening.
Okay. Children, cover your ears.
Children, cover your ears. There's this bogey that basically cuts open the stomach of naughty children. There's in Greece during the 12 days of Christmas, and we see this theme a lot with the 12 days of Christmas. We know it from the song, but there is a lot of belief in the sort of magic of the 12 days of Christmas. And as I mentioned before, this sort of like the darkness and the veil thinning and the overlapping and traditions between the solstice and Yule and Christmas time and Hanukkah and all of these kind of traditions where you're, burning a light against the darkness. So there's this horrid beast, half human and half animal. And in Greece, they call him I'm going to just read it from my manuscript here because Karkanzaroi or the Kalakanzaroi, he's called both. And what this guy does is he's just this like horrendous beast. Will remind you quite a bit of Krampus, who's kind of a more well-known version of this guy. And he's sort of a trickster. He's half human. He's a little bit werewolfy looking, and he will kind of tear apart a household. He will, break things. And in worst case scenarios, he can even bring on death, although it's often from fright. Mm-hmm. So he's out and about all during the 12 days of Christmas. And again, you are not to be out walking alone under any circumstances, and children should never be out after dark. And then you also have, of course, Krampus is probably, fairly well known. Krampus has gotten more popular in the United States in recent years. And he's sort of a half goat, half man creature. And all of these beasts, what they serve, they have that similar theme, which is to punish naughty children. So Krampus walks around with a switch. And actually, Krampus is often seen with Saint Nicholas. And so where Krampus will deal with the naughty children and Saint Nicholas will deal with the good children. Now, our Santa Claus takes care of both. But in many traditions, you have this other kind of creature, and it will follow along behind him. There are parades, and you have, something that's kind of out after them. But my favorite of all of the sort of Christmas magical creatures is Befana. And Befana is the Italian witch. She flies, I believe her night is January 6th. So it's still around the same kind of holiday tradition. And of course, in Italy, where she is from, they celebrate Christmas. And then Befana comes, and Befana's tradition is she's a witch and she rides on her broom from rooftop to rooftop. She slides down through the chimney and she sweeps the hearth, and she leaves gifts for good children and, rocks for children who aren't good. So it's essentially the same idea that we have of Santa Claus coming down the chimney. And the chimney, actually, I found something kind of interesting about that the idea, I was thinking, like, why do we think of Santa Claus as coming down the chimney? Is it just because we locked the doors? There's got to be some other kind of origin to that. And I found that it was actually often believed that the Norse god Odin came and entered the home through the chimney. And that, of course, Befana was another one, and that St. Nicholas eventually took the chimney because he couldn't get in the front door.
Wow. What you're talking about, I remember a story regarding St. Nicholas that a friend of mine, I went to a school called St. Teresa, Palatine, Illinois. It was a Catholic school. We had uniforms, all that. And I remember on the bus rides, because of the paranormal experiences I was having throughout grade school, I would share some of the stories. And some of my best friends, one of them, Carl, he told me this story. It was right after Christmas. He goes, "Hey, I had an experience I want to share with you. I don't want to tell anyone else." And I'm like, "What is it?" He goes, "Well, we had some family staying over, so I had to sleep in the family room where the Christmas tree was in the fireplace. And this was Christmas Eve, and slept. I woke up in the morning because I felt something, and I looked over, and I saw this, like a ghost. It was glowing. It was white, and it was over by the fireplace, and it had its back to me, and it was by the tree. And it had this like cone-shaped hat on, and it turned. It looked at me. He said, had a beard, everything, and then did a sign of the cross, and was wearing some type of cloak, like older type, kind of like a bishop type thing or whatever. And he said he had a cross on his chest, and it was either on his chest or it was on the cone. I can't remember, but he said he did the sign of the cross, smiled, and then he turned and he glided like a ghost right through the chimney, the fireplace, and he was gone. So our conclusion was that he saw Saint Nick, but the real Saint Nick, not Santa Claus. We're talking about the saint,
right.
Because
Right.
we all went to a Catholic school, so maybe that's how it would appear, and that's how it truly is, the spirit and the soul of that. I don't know. So I grew up believing that, Santa Claus, the guy in the red suit drinking Coca-Cola, he doesn't really exist, but that there is the spirit of Christmas, that the Saint Nick will appear to certain people. And Carl was such a nice guy, one of the nicest guys. He did great in school. He would never really harm anybody. So I think he had such a spiritual soul that Saint Nick appeared to him, or at least let him know that he existed. To me, I was like, wow, I mean, I haven't seen anything like that. I mean, I did see something on Easter that I'm not ready to go public talking about yet. But for me, that was cool. And it was a great Christmas story. Do you have any other stories where people have saw Santa Claus or saw some type of ghost on Christmas or Christmas Eve?
Oh, certainly. I mean, there's this wonderful collection. It's very difficult to just read from beginning to end, but it's a wonderful collection about Welsh traditions, and it's put together by a man named Clement Miles. And I think it was written in the late 1700s, possibly the early 1800s, where he traveled, much like Yeats traveled around Ireland. He traveled around Wales, and he wrote down a lot of these traditions. And he talks a lot about some of the sort of like Yule rituals in which, it was believed, and this has such a lovely crossover with sort of the Catholic idea of water turning into, or the Christian idea of water into wine, where on Christmas Eve or on the, Yule Eve, the wells would run with, they would turn to blood, and you could drink like this blood from the ground. And if you drank it, you'd be able to commune with all of the animals.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of stories, like his collection are stories of people saying, and this was not that long ago. And of course, modern times, we have lost many of these. We begin to think of them more as myths, and instead of, knowing someone who has actually had this experience and is passing it down. But I think, there's certainly, children especially, as you well know, are the ones that see the most.
Oh yeah, it's my childhood all the time.
Exactly. And, it all, it can come down to how our parents handled it. For example, you were talking about the Ouija board, not to get back down that road, but I had a similar experience to what you had, only with mine, it was the ghost of a young girl who, it turned out that there was actually a grave not far from where my parents' house is, that was sort of a like old miner they live in an old mining town in California. And so this lone grave of this little girl who had probably died when she was 8. And we got a Ouija board from our mom for Christmas. I mean, my mother was very
Yeah, I got
open.
one too when I was a kid. Another one,
Right.
like our third or fourth
We're
model.
probably the same age. Yeah, there was just this era where,
Yay, Ouija board! Woo! Let's talk to the devil. Yes.
Yes, but I remember, we were playing with it. My sister and I were playing with it because that's what you did. And my mom said, "Well, what are you girls doing? Who are you talking to?" And we said, "Elise." And my mother had knew the name of this grave, of this little girl in the grave. And she promptly walked over, snatched up the board, closed it, took the planchet, put it all back in the box, and walked out of the room with it. And to this day, I don't know what she did with it. She won't tell me,
Wow.
but she said, "Absolutely not. You are opening a door and you are not equipped to close that door." And
It's
we were
true,
like,
man. That is true.
I goofed around with it as a teenager, and I have to admit, I goofed around in some very dangerous circumstances, using the Ouija board under the influence of things. So I definitely had some very dangerous experiences with it, and that I'm, not particularly proud of. But it is certainly, especially for sensitive children that have, the ability to see things and to see ghosts. Definitely it can be a detrimental tool when you're not equipped. You're welcome to open the door if you know how to close it. But if you don't close it, it can be very dangerous.
Well, yeah.
Yes, I think there are many accounts of children seeing things, especially some of these smaller little creatures like the Nissen and the Tantu in the Scandinavian countries, who look very much like Santa Claus, as I had said. So I think what we have today as what we think of as Santa Claus or Old Saint Nick is sort of an evolution over time with many different cultures' influence of this bearded man, from Odin to Sinterklaas to this, to the Tomten, the Scandinavian troll. They all sort of meld together. And even the early Victorian stories about Santa Claus and the famous Night Before Christmas talks about him as a jolly old elf. So everyone has believed that he was from another realm, that he was an entity rather than an actual man.
The one thing that intrigues me is this, and it gets confusing. And sometimes people can assume it's one thing, yet it's another. Like, many ghost stories, people say, "I saw an angel." Well, how do you know it's an angel? And they describe it, and it's just a ghost. And then sometimes people will say it's a demon, or they are seeing an angel, and it's actually, they think it's a ghost. It's our assumptions and how we try to gauge things. Over the years, I published a magazine in the 90s. I had a personal experience that occurred on Easter that I used to tell everybody at school about, and I grew up believing that that's what I experienced, and it wasn't until I had a regression that it was something else. And I'm going to write a book about this. It's going to be my third book I write. Called It Happened One Easter. The point I'm getting at, without giving that whole story away, is I'll just make people think. But people that know me, grew up with me, they know exactly what I'm talking about. Is I investigated and researched when I did a magazine on aliens back in 98, 97, and talked to some well-known investigators and doctors at the time. Some of them passed away since then, in regressions and things that they've uncovered, where people have thought they've seen Santa Claus, leprechauns, and all these other things, and under regression have found out that it's alien abductions, that they were actually aliens, but they implanted in their head and make them believe that it was something related to that holiday that was going on. That's crazy when things start to mess with your head and make you believe one thing and you think it's something else. Have you run into any situations, because I know there's stories out there with aliens on Christmas, but I think that sounds like an album, Aliens on Christmas. Aliens on Christmas. Should be like a hit. But have you run into anything like that, where it's been alien abductions or anything on Christmas and people thought they've seen something?
Oh, I certainly think so. I mean, one year I was on Coast to Coast, and we were talking with George Norrie, and we were talking about sort of Christmas traditions and creepy things. And we had several people call in, and the callers are just probably, not the best part of that show, but I love that aspect of the show because you get these amazing stories. And there were several people who called in and talked about experiences that they had when they, either when they were children or as adults, some sort of strange thing they had heard in the night or something that they saw out of the corner of their eyes. Now, whether or not that's alien abduction or another entity, or, or if those things are really that different, I don't know that we'll ever know, but we're going to continue to try and find out, of course, right?
Right.
I definitely think that because, you have this idea of even Charles Dickens talked a lot about the ghosts, right? The ghosts of Christmas past, and, these ghosts with rattling chains, and the ghost of Christmas present. And he was quite obsessed with the Christmas ghost. Well, that is again, just going back to that idea that it's a very magical, but also a time when you can commune with the deceased and you can commune with the other world. And, I think I have had many people write to me, not necessarily specifically at Christmas, but I even had a woman say, I saw this thing, I think it was a merman. And she sent me a picture of it and gave me a description, which I included in my book about mermaids. And you will find that very few people are willing to admit that they think they've seen a mermaid. People will admit to ghosts, but they won't always admit to, something like a mermaid. And this was an incredible story. And the drawing that she said, it almost reminded me of those drawings, the sketches that people do after a, alien abduction. Well, it looked like this. It had eyes like this. It didn't look like that, but just there's something about it that sort of this encounter and her recalling of it that just sort of reminded me, it sparked in me that idea that like, well, what are these things that are pulling people off, rural roads in the dark of night? Is it something like the bellsnickle that's out there hunting about,
right,
and looks like an animal, or is it, some kind of like higher being that has a craft and has a whole plan?
Right, and they disguise it and make you believe it's something else, and then people think you're crazy. It's just insane how all these possibilities and these things can occur.
If you walked into a room and you said, I've seen an imp in my room,
Mm-hmm.
how many people would think you were crazier than saying I've seen an alien in my room?
Yeah, more people would believe the imp thing because a lot of people have had the experiences, yeah.
Yeah, you think, but there's, I think there's so much overlap with these other worlds, and we just know so little about them, and we just have this slice of them. And with many of the kind of, fairy realm creatures and magical creatures, we have removed ourselves to the point where they become something of folklore. So we may not always recognize them when we see them, or when we do see them, we don't quite know what to make of them. But I've had many people write to me with experiences, not exactly like what you were describing, but seeing some kind of creature that it did not fit the idea of a ghost.
Sure.
Often was recurring, or other things encountered it. The banshee is the banshee is basically like a ghost and a fairy all at once, and that is one of the more extreme examples of something that sort of appears and warns you. And there are warning ghosts. There are many variations of a banshee-like creature across culturally. Almost every culture has an example of some kind of supernatural being that warns them of illness or death.
And a banshee will have like a shrieking sound, screaming sound?
The screaming sound is kind of the distinct characteristic, and it's actually, to me, in the descriptions I've read, it reminds me, if you've ever been to a funeral and heard Irish keening, which is this mournful wail that kind of takes place at traditional Irish funerals. It's very like that. And it's this haunting sound. Banshees are thought to have, maybe died in childbirth, or the spirits of, women whose children died young. I mean, it's one of the few sort of magical creatures that, doesn't, it's the name Banshee translates to of the fairy mound, but it's so much more like a ghost than any of the other beings.
Yeah.
And it just kind of reiterated in my mind that, I think I went into researching these sort of bizarre creatures and things with the idea that they had their own categories separate from ghosts.
Wow.
Separate from, and I think, the more I read about it, the more I see the threads that connect and realize that it kind of is all in your position and how connected you are to, the whatever environment you live in. If you live out in the middle of, Finland, and you don't see very many people because you live in a small town or it's the dead of winter, you're going to have a very different experience than when you're living in the heart of San Francisco. And the things that were knocking on my walls, were they ghosts or were they old Tommyknockers,
Right.
which were also kind of equated with leprechauns. So when you really start digging into these things, there's, it's very difficult to really truly categorize any one thing as a specific entity, although banshees are, kind of in a class of themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And, when you talk about Christmas, the Christmas Carol, favorite story, Charles Dickens, was known for his infamous ghosts of Christmas past, the present, and the future. And I remember there's a movie came out a couple years ago that was in 3D, and it was phenomenal. And I saw it in 3D, and it was just, I was like, wow, they kind of reinvented the story, and it was all animation. It was just amazing. And the way they did the ghosts and all that, I really, truly enjoyed it. It was entertaining. What other ghostly Christmas endeavors has Charles Dickens undertaken?
So he was a huge fan of Christmas ghosts, apparently. Every year, so he was, for many, many years, he was the editor of a publication called All Year Round. And this was sort of during the late Victorian, early Edwardian era. And it was a pamphlet that was, distributed all year round. And every year he would do a Christmas supplement. And I believe it was in 1894, he did this Christmas supplement, and it was called The Haunted House. So totally not your typical Christmas thing. Mm-hmm. And the story begins with this man who is sort of, seeking respite from the world. And he travels on a train to this small town in the English countryside. And he comes upon this house, which, looks okay. And then he goes inside and it's just sort of decaying and falling apart. And he says, I'll take it. And he takes it for 6 months. And then what Dickens did is he took some of his favorite writers of the time that he was publishing, including like Adelaide Proctor, who was this woman who was a very famous poet and was like Queen Victoria's favorite poet, and Wilkie Collins, who was a big who he was a big fan, and they became great friends. And Wilkie Collins published many plays, and they acted together. He took this haunted house, and he assigned the rooms, and he had each writer write about the ghost of that house, of that room. So there was the ghost in the cupboard room. There was the ghost in Master B's room. And you had all the different writers kind of do this interpretation. And he talks about when he's setting the stage, it's almost like, it was a dark and stormy night, and we all joined together in this house. I mean, you can imagine like the ultimate paranormal parlor game where everyone comes together. They take up residence in this house over the 12 nights of Christmas. And what they are to do is to spend every night in that room. And if they have any issues or experience anything they need to talk about, they can knock on the door of the host. And the host, of course, is written from Charles Dickens is playing this character. They knock on the door and they can talk to him, but they're not to share their experiences with anyone else because they don't want to sort of like color each other's opinions. Mm-hmm. Then on the 12th night, they all get together and then they tell everything and they confess and they give their recount of what, if anything, they experienced in these rooms. and they're not to speak of it until that night. And it's just this wonderful, and then each author has then taken on the perspective of these ghosts. And then you just get into this whole crossover between ghosts as a literary device and ghosts as, coming out of, what your idea of a ghost is and what that ghost was there to teach you. And he talks about the 12th night and how the 12th night is a night when, spirits run amok and the veil is very thin. And then there's this wonderful description of, the decaying wallpaper and the moldy well and all of these, great elements to the story, because it's Dickens and he's, if nothing, he's detailed, to say the least. So it's just this kind of wonderful thing. And that's not his only ghostly endeavor, but you will find that Dickens, we know the Christmas Carol, and we kind of know sort of a shinier version of it, but he was quite a dark writer, and he definitely grappled with the idea of the other world. And I kind of like to imagine that when he commissioned these writers to write their point of view, I like to imagine that he was also trying to determine how other people perceive ghosts and the paranormal world, because he was certainly very interested in that.
I wish he was still alive to talk to about it. And it's interesting how a lot of these writers have had ghost experiences. I mean, Stephen King, and the list goes on and on. I want to change avenue for a second. I mean, you've got a bunch of books that you've written. You've got Banshees, Werewolves, Vampires, and Other Creatures of the Night, Among the Mermaids, The Book of the Bizarre, and Beyond Bizarre. And then you've got a new book coming out in April called Fairies, Pookas, Changelings, and A Complete Guide to the Wicked and Wild Enchanted Realm. Now, all these books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, or IndieBound. And then you've got a website, varlaventura.net. That's V-A-R-L-A, Ventura, V-E-N-T-U-R-A.net. What can people find at your website?
You will find I've been putting a few teasers from my book on there. I actually just also recorded a reading of Wilkie Collins' story. He was the ghost in the cupboard room. For my publisher, they have their own little radio hour, and so I'm reading that as a Christmas tale, sort of a dark Christmas tale. But I keep people up to date on. I also have a new book, a manuscript I'm working on now, which is about ghosts, and ghosts and paranormal parlor and different kind of everything from trickery to the truth. And I'm sort of collecting people's accounts and ghost stories for that, because in both of my books, both the book of the, and actually in all of my books, I always like to talk to people who have had the experiences. And that includes, I've spoken with vampires, and I have some firsthand accounts of, mermaid encounters and things like that. So of course, ghosts would fall. I want lots of info from people about their own experiences, because I think that really adds an element to it that you can't find anywhere else. It's nice to sit around and read ghost stories, and so that'll be a part of the book. In any case, I put some excerpts, and occasionally I run contests and fun things like that. And my next book will be coming out in April. It's available for pre-order now.
It's great.
Yeah, you can contact me also through the website, or, through Facebook, or many other, modern ways of getting a hold of me.
Yeah, I just looked at it, and you've got a lot of blogs on there too, with some articles that people can go and read some interesting topics that you cover there. Have you ever, I'm going back to the first question, we talked about the Scandinavian Christmas trolls. Have you seen the movie Rare Exports?
I don't think so.
It is really good, and I believe it's a Scandinavian film. It's an independent film, and I believe it's dubbed or subtitled. And it was great. It's about where these miners, whatever, they're blowing up this mountain, and it's like around wintertime, and they uncover this big block of ice, and there's something inside it, and they defrost it, and guess who it is? It's Santa Claus.
I have seen it. I saw it now that you were describing that, because I think I had watched the movie Trolls, I think it's called, which is also a Scandinavian film, and then it's either made by the same people or it, popped up and said, if you like trolls, you'll like Rare Exports.
I
I
love
love
Trolls. I love
it.
Trolls.
Yeah, it was a wonderful movie.
God, was it great? It was like it's like watching a fiction version of Destination Truth, where um, Josh Gates is going around, but you got this foreign guy, and he's hunting down these trolls. And this couple's filming, says, "Hey, can we follow you?" And they're like, "Yeah, right. There's no such thing as this." And they end up seeing the trolls and these giant trolls. It's amazing, and the government covers it up. It's such a great story, and the special effects are fantastic. It's very entertaining. But like you said, I mean, Rare Exports is kind of similar to that, but now we're dealing with Santa Claus, and is it Santa Claus or is it Krampus? And it's good.
Yeah, and it's so very common that Krampus basically in many situations Krampus kind of does the dirty work that so that Saint Nicholas can remain this wonderful revered saint, and no one need fear that Saint Nicholas is going to whip them.
Right.
But they should be afraid of Krampus, who will put them in a bag and carry them off in the night and beat them and all manner of like horrible things. Now I do want to say one thing about a lot of these traditions. And today we have this like obsession with the elf on the shelf that's watching us, and a lot of these ideas around the Christmas time and the naughty children. It also has occurred to me that this is a way of keeping children safe in a manner of speaking. So don't go out, in Greece, they say don't go out on any of these nights. Well, it can also be a way of keeping children closer to the fire, so to speak, keeping children away from some of the dangers of, whatever lurks beyond in the deep, dark forest. And they harken back to a time when we didn't have electricity, we didn't have telephones, we didn't have, modern hospitals. So there were, warnings that you used, and that some of these tales, and I'm certainly not saying that they aren't true, but that they evolved out of this need to protect, the young, even werewolves to a certain extent, and that the myths and the myths and the sort of scare factor kind of overlapped in order to, like this horrible swamp creature that would pull children down in. Well, of course, the mothers are busy doing all the washing and all manner of things, and they can't watch the children all the time, so they don't want them going into the, the quick swamp.
Sure.
They don't want them hanging around in the peat, so that, it's like, don't go over there. Peg Powler will pull you down in, and you won't get back out. So there's a lot of, like, that kind of fear in there that I think, kind of lends itself, and then that evolves. And I even had this wonderful man call in and tell this story about, well, don't you know about the elf with the pointy shoes? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not familiar with this story. And he went on to tell how he and his wife were trying to put together bikes for their kids for Christmas. And the kids kept like getting up out of bed and poking their heads around the corner. And so finally the guy got up and he said, you have to stay in bed, because if you're not careful, the elf with the pointy shoes will come along and he will kick you. So you must stay in bed, because you don't want to be kicked by the elf with pointy shoes. And all he was trying to do was, keep the kids away so he could put these bikes together. And he said, I don't know where this came from. It just came out, So there's also this kind of, there's this storytelling element.
Right.
I love, and I think is very important. I think we take so much time trying to understand things, and, we're constantly processing and trying to make sense of things. And the beauty of the story and folklore and these tales is that you're listening to them, you're hearing these stories, and in that moment you have suspended your doubt. Even if you just think, oh, this is a lovely fiction story, you're still immersed in the story and you've suspended your doubt. And when you do that, you actually open yourself up to another level of understanding and communication. and probably the ability to, see things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And we need this. And if we don't have this, then we're horrible misers that walk around clinging to all the things we know, and we never do creative things, and we never think outside the box, and we never, believe in something outside of our own two hands. And so I think that, they serve a greater purpose in many ways.
No, absolutely. And so I have to ask, we've only got a few more minutes left, but are there any positive stories? Are there any? We're talking about the little creatures and scary stuff and eating children and everything.
Well, I mean, I thought we might as well get that out of the way, and you can put a warning in the beginning. So I think, the best stories are some of the lovely little things. Like actually, the Tomten is a nice one. The Tomten, which is the sort of little elf-like thing that's really only a few inches high, has a tall pointy red hat, and you just leave him a little porridge, and he leaves you gifts, and he cleans your house, and he basically blesses your home. So this is a really nice idea. And now today, in any family of Scandinavian descent, you will find on their tree or sitting in a little pot outside their door. And it's almost like the garden gnome. Like they look sort of like gnomes with their pointy hats and, their little roundy noses and stuff. You will find these little Tomten creatures. And, the kids will leave a little cookie for it. So this is a really popular idea that is very widely believed. And you don't mess around with the Tomten, or as I said, it's also called the Nisi. It's called Tantu in Finland. And they're delightful, and they basically leave a gift in exchange. So that's a nice little a little character that kind of appears regularly, and you can keep them in your Christmas box and pull them out at Christmas time. And you have many lovely little, the idea of elves being sort of Santa's helpers. You have elves that bring you gifts, and, fairies that tend your garden and make sure your home is clean and that your children are protected. And in general, although some fairies are out to snatch your children, there are many, many, sort of spirits that look out for kids. And, you figure if you're only 3 feet high, you're going to naturally gravitate toward, a kid and look out for a kid. So there's some, nice things like that. And then of course we have the beautiful idea of Santa's flying reindeer, which is believed to come from the idea that that you could commune with animals at this time of year, and that if you offered and treated them well, they could do magical things on the solstice, or which later became Christmas Eve. So you would have this kind of ability to speak with animals, and that there are many elves that have that ability, and people can have that ability if they, are open to it on Christmas Eve. So if you have an open heart and an open mind and a little luck and a little magic, you can also actually hear horses and reindeer speak. And I think they even say that Odin flew across the night sky, and he's a big bearded fellow. He flew across the night sky with a I think it was like 8 horses or something.
Right.
This evolved into our reindeer.
So your favorite Christmas movies, what are they?
My favorite Christmas movie is It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
And there is a supernatural element to that, which, I didn't really identify until I was an adult, that there was a supernatural element to it. The idea of, this angel kind of taking him back through what his life would be like if he had never been born. Mm-hmm. That's probably my all-time favorite.
Yeah, that's my favorite well as with Will Ferrell and Elf.
Oh yeah, well,
I love that movie.
Pretty fun one too. Yeah, Elf is a fun one, and I actually just saw the play of the Happy Elf, which is like a Harry Connick Jr. musical.
Yeah,
and it's very funny. They talk a lot actually about like the elves' magic and how they can use their hat to like travel anywhere in the world, and they have this magic hat, and if they lose the hat or give the hat away, then, they lose their magic and they basically get, put into, elf prison or whatever. So
that's pretty cool.
It's cute. Yeah.
Well, listen, I want to thank you very much for being on the show. And for those listening, please check out our website, varlaventura.net, and pick up one of her books, or maybe all of them. You can go to Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, or IndieBound, pick up the Banshees, Werewolves, Vampires, and Other Creatures of the Night, the other book, Among the Mermaids, the book of Bizarre and Beyond Bizarre, and then check out our new book coming out in April, which you can pre-order on our website, varlaventura.net, is the book called Fairies, Pookas, and Changelings, A Complete Guide to the Wicked and Wild Enchanted Realm. I'm going to have you on again in 2017 because I do want to talk about the fairies, the Pookas, and your new book.
Well, that would be wonderful. I would love to be back. It would be an honor.
Awesome. Well, I want to wish you a happy holidays, and hopefully you got all your shopping done.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, my books make great stocking stuffers. They do fit nicely in there. And Among the Mermaids is actually pretty safe for children. Well, within reason.
That's right.
If you grew up reading Grimm's fairy tales, you can handle it.
Right.
Thank you so much, Chris, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year and Merry Meet.
You got it. This is Chris Fleming, Varla Ventura. You've been listening to this edition of Spirit Talk. I'll see you next month.